From suppressing freedom of speech to controversial sporting decisions, the FIA has been under scrutiny for a few years now. In fact, after its recent ban on quote-unquote political statements, the drivers hate the association too, and they've got every right to do so. After all, the FIA has been an absolute mess over the past few years. I mean, where do I even begin? Wrong decisions for on-track incidents? Check. Having little to no accountability? Also check. And not letting people speak up for social justice? Of course, check. It's honestly been incredible to see just how much the dynamic between the FIA and the sport has changed recently. Obviously, the association's president, Ben Sulayem, has got a lot to do with that as well. But if all of this sounds like gibberish to you, and you've got no idea why the drivers hate this new direction, then it's time for a quick rundown. You see, over the past few years, we've seen drivers like Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton champion causes, like Black Lives Matter and climate change awareness. Now, these seem like pretty noble things to do, right? Apparently, the FIA doesn't like it one bit. Yup, for some bizarre reason, the sporting authority updated its code ahead of the 2023 season by adding an extra clause. And essentially, what this clause did was ban any comments that were either political, religious, or personal in nature. Why? Well, according to them, they'd like to maintain the political neutrality of sport, whatever that's supposed to mean. Now this, of course, baffled the drivers. After all, how could a sport that's been talking about inclusivity and eliminating its carbon footprint try to stop its drivers from talking about those things? Like, it doesn't make any sense, right? Sure, you could say the conversation is a lot more nuanced, or we don't know exactly what sort of political statements they're trying to block. But the fact remains that this was perhaps a step too far from the FIA. So, naturally, the drivers stood up and spoke against it. Alex Albon, for instance, recently said that this whole directive is super confusing because the FIA is trying to move away from its own messages. Not to mention, the association hasn't done a great job of being transparent with its thought process either, which means that basically no one's got any idea of what they're trying to do. And for Albon, it's just not right to stop drivers from speaking up about all the issues we're facing. After all, a lot of people do look up to them as spokespeople for issues around the world. Also, obviously, others like Vettel, Verstappen, and Hamilton echoed the same sentiments too. Speaking of Hamilton though, he's got beef with the FIA as well. I mean, that really shouldn't come off as a surprise, because he's the one who's been the most vocal about social justice. For instance, back in 2020, he wore a t-shirt that read, "Arrest the cops who killed Breonna Taylor" during the podium ceremony. And while the FIA didn't make him take it off right there and then, they probably couldn't even if they tried, they still clamped down on him after that, however, forbidding him from doing the same thing again. Oh, and let's not forget all the drama with the jewelry last season. The FIA also tried to clamp down on the 7-time champion because he wore jewelry while racing. The issue with that, though, was that it wasn't exactly stuff he could easily remove. Now, this turned into a whole thing, and there was a lot of back and forth between Hamilton and the FIA. But I'd say that the Brit had the last laugh when he turned up to a Grand Prix wearing multiple sets of jewelry and watches, just to spite the association. Yeah, that was a GOAT move if I've ever seen one. With that said, this is just the tip of the iceberg as far as issues with the FIA are concerned. After all, the sporting body has totally lost the drivers' trust. Even if you disregard all the political issues, things still aren't exactly ideal in Formula One. We see inconsistent decisions from race directors almost every single week. Not to mention, there was a whole championship decided on a decision that was later deemed as quote-unquote human error. Plus, you've got the whole safety controversy from last year's Japanese Grand Prix too, where a recovery vehicle was allowed on the track while other cars were still out there in the rain. I mean, at that point, it's just sheer incompetence and negligence, especially when you think about how we lost Jules Bianchi in 2015 due to the exact same reason. But rather than fixing these issues, it seems like the FIA cares more about protecting its own image and blaming everyone else. Though, they might be at a crossroads in that regard as well, because guess what? Formula One has decided to push back against the FIA's directives. Yup, the tug of war has begun, and F1 CEO Stefano Domenicali is at the front. He recently spoke up against the FIA's latest directive as well, insisting that Formula One will never put a gag on anyone. What's more, he also said that the FIA will have to clarify exactly what it means by its new rule. Here's the real kicker though. Domenicali isn't afraid to back out of races like Qatar and Saudi Arabia if they don't improve their human rights record. Now, this one's really big, because F1 has been accused recently of sport washing by holding races in their countries. And to be fair, racing a few kilometers away from a literal missile crash was a tad weird last year. So, it's great to see the sport taking a stand in this regard. In fact, F1 CEO even mentioned how they've got a clause in the contract that allows them to terminate their relationship, especially if these countries don't respond to human rights concerns. Plus, of course, he also confirmed that they're going to continue with the We Race as One initiative and allow their drivers to speak up about inclusivity as well. Besides, Domenicali's stance may have borne fruit already because, yup, the FIA president has just stepped back from overseeing F1. Now, if you don't already know, Ben Sulayem was one of the core instigators of the Sporting Authority's recent transition. In fact, the entirety of his 12-month tenure has been filled with controversy, whether that's related to bringing on new teams into the sport or trying to silence the drivers. Oh, and don't forget the whole thing with Sulayem calling F1's $20 billion price tag inflated either. It was a little bit too spicy between him and the sport. So, after a year of drama and pressure, he's finally decided to step back from his position and hand over the day-to-day F1 operations to Nicolas Tombazzi. Though, it's worth noting that he's not stepping down from his position as the president. It's just that he seems to have had enough of F1, which perhaps is the only motorsport in a position to push back against his organization right now. So the question is, will Sulayem's exit change anything? Well, in theory, yes. After all, with him out of the picture, Formula One will hopefully be a much more open place, where drivers actually have a direct line of communication with the FIA. Plus, we could see them walking back on some of their directives as well, including the thing with political statements and jewelry. As far as the rest of the operations are concerned, however, it's hard to tell. I mean, it's not like they've suddenly hired a competent team of race directors. But hey, this is a crazy sport, and anything can happen. And on that note, this was why F1 drivers don't like the FIA. See you in the next one.
These tyres are a lot older than Hamilton's. Hamilton moves out from behind the rear wing of the Alpine.